open our service tonight with an Azkara, a memorial for Prime Minister Yitzchak Rabin, who 30 years ago was assassinated by a fellow Jew in his pursuit of peace. At 9:42 p.m. on the night of the 12th of Cheshvan, corresponding this year to this Sunday night, November 2nd, 30 years ago in the year of 5756 on November 4th, 1995 on the Western calendar. We will do this before we bring in Shabbat, our candles not yet being lit, because of the very powerful Jewish tradition that there is no mourning on Shabbat. Even Shiva is not sat on Shabbat, which I think is our ancestors' way through ritual of reminding us psychologically that even the hardest challenges we face are never 100% of all there is in life. Reminding us that our joy, our love, is just as real, and that better times are something we can indeed reach. Promised lands are there to be reached. So we will begin by taking this moment of memory together tonight. And this will be our Devar Torah for tonight, before we then cross into lighting our candles for Shabbat. This will be our Devar Torah tonight, not only as a moment of memory and of immersing in the legacy of this great modern Jewish leader, but also because it is part and parcel of Torah and Jewish prayer that we learn from the lives of our patriarchs. We are beginning in our parsha this week with the story of Abraham and Sarah heeding the call, Lech Lecha, go forth, to come to the land of Canaan and to begin the journey that launches the whole journey of the Jewish people. The original Yitzchak, Isaac, will be born in next week's parsha. And of course, in every time we gather in Jewish prayer, in the Amidah, we begin by invoking God as Elohei Avraham, as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And when we sing those familiar words, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, we are saying, as we say in the Parshiot, by reading these stories every year, we are saying that one of the ways that we sense the divine presence in our world is through the stories of our ancestors. Through sensing our ancestors' stories, how they came to know the divine presence according to what that means for each of us. And as they lived, perhaps seeing a glint in how they lived of how we might sense the divine now. Or as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, the Torah is not a human theology, it's God's anthropology. It's God's vision through the lives of our ancestors of what the divine presence expects of each of us. And as we learn this in the stories of our patriarchs and matriarchs and all of our ancestors, perhaps we can sense the divine in the story of our great modern Yitzchak, our great modern patriarch of Isaac. The Talmud records a story in which one rabbi says to another, Jacob, our patriarch, did not die. And his colleague and friend says to him, but isn't his death recorded in the Torah? And the first rabbi says, just as his descendants live, so too does Jacob live. So perhaps tonight we might meditate on the midot, the character traits by which our modern Yitzchak lived and for which he died. And perhaps, as the Talmud guides us, if we are able to live that much more by these midot, these character traits, and shape our time that much more in this vision, perhaps, even as we mark the tragic death of Yitzchak Rabin, perhaps we can sustain his spirit living among us. And there could be no time more pivotal to channel Rabin's legacy than now. No time more than now when the call of his legacy could be more clarion. Our time of so much suffering and so much loss on all sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and such a terrible stalemate in which each side strikes the other, and it may seem unclear what a path forward would be, not just after October 7th, but following all of the Israel-Hamas wars that seem to recur every few years, like clockwork, a very disturbing, dark, macabre clockwork. We will continue to reckon with and to mourn the loss of the 1,200 who were murdered on October 7th simply for living in the modern Jewish homeland. And at the same time, as we mourn their loss, as we hold in our hearts the suffering of the hostages, which indeed will continue as their mental health and their physical health represents a journey that has many, many stages ahead. And at the very same time, we hold in our hearts the loss and the destruction that has befallen the Palestinians in Gaza, who are children of Abraham just as we are, as I spoke about in my Devar Torah about Israel and Gaza to launch our month of Elul. So in this time of stalemate, perhaps as we look back to the midot, the character traits of Yitzchak Rabin, perhaps they can guide us, and we are surely in need of guidance. Perhaps they can restore some of the inspiration that we know lies within the spark of each human soul, if only we can reach it once again. I might suggest 4 classic midot, 4 character traits that defined Yitzchak Rabin's life. First, he lived by the principle that the status quo can be changed. Stalemates can be changed. And the action we take can contribute to bringing this change to life. This sounds simple when said in the abstract. In real life, in the muck of the stalemates of war and frozen diplomacy, nothing could be more radical. And we might now look back at the 90s as a golden age of the peace process and think of how far we've fallen since then, and surely we have fallen quite far. And at the same time, perhaps it's of use to remember that the past was not always a halcyon, better world than what we have now. That is to say, leading up to the peace process of the 90s, the era of the mid to late 80s was a stalemate not unlike our own. And as we see how Rabin addressed it, perhaps that can give us guidance and inspiration for how we might address our time. This was a time in the mid to late 80s when the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, did not recognize Israel and had previously shot rockets targeting Israeli civilians in the Galilee. Israel would not negotiate with a group that did not recognize it and that targeted its civilians. This was the era, as the 80s went on, of the First Intifada, not, to be clear, the notorious Second Intifada, in which Palestinian terrorists, particularly from Hamas, intentionally targeted centers of Israeli civilian life, like buses and restaurants. That's a different era in the early 2000s. But the First Intifada of the late 80s, I'll share with you the way that Tom Friedman described it in his classic From Beirut to Jerusalem. He described it as a time of nightly broadcasts of heavily armed Israeli troops opening fire on Palestinians armed only with stones. The West Bankers and Gazans dared to challenge the Israelis the way David challenged Goliath. The IDF was known to give Palestinian rioters beatings, and the defense minister in this government was in fact none other than Yitzchak Rabin, a Likud-headed government in which Labour was a coalition partner. The great Israeli singer-songwriter Chava Alberstein wrote a song in 1989 that was a modern version of the Seder song Chag Gadya, the familiar fable. She wrote a modern version using that imagery of that song to describe the hopeless cycle of violence of that time. She described it as a time in which endlessly the dog bites the cat and the cat bites the dog, and how can we ever escape from it? And in the midst of this stalemate, when Yitzchak Rabin became prime minister in 1992, he and Yasser Arafat shocked the world through his sending a letter to Arafat that recognized the PLO and recognized the Palestinian people and recognized the PLO as their representative. And Arafat's letter recognized the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security, leading to the iconic moment when Arafat, Rabin, and Bill Clinton shared the White House lawn as Arafat and Rabin shook hands. It was, in essence, an agreement simply to talk and negotiate toward an agreement in a time when that was so taboo, and Rabin believed that breaking that taboo was the only way to get to a better future. He and Arafat ultimately negotiated toward an interim agreement in which about 40% ultimately of the West Bank, as well as all of Gaza, was transferred to what became the Palestinian Authority. And regarding breaking this taboo, Rabin famously said, peace is made with enemies. Shalom osim im oyevim. That is to say, a taboo on talking with enemies will never lead to constructive progress and to a way forward, and indeed, ultimately to peace. Now, this is not to deny the many sides and the many complexities of the political situation, because, as we know from history, ultimately the 90s talks broke down under Ehud Barak, Rabin's labor successor. At the end of those talks, Yasser Arafat said to Bill Clinton, "You are a great statesman." And Bill Clinton said, "No, I'm a failure, and you made me one." Because under Bill Clinton's shepherding, Israel offered the Palestinians almost everything that was asked for toward a two-state solution, and Arafat would not accept. This gave rise to the Second Intifada, as I mentioned, a time of breathtaking terror for Israeli civilians on buses, in restaurants, anywhere. So this is not to deny the many complexities, but I think we see in Rabin's values a commitment to the principle that the status quo can be changed, and that we must take action to strive to change it, and that if and when we do, our actions matter, and therefore we cannot give up on resolving to continue to look for options that have not yet been tried, to think about what conventions and taboos might be standing in the way of progress, and to strive to do so with all our might. This brings us then to a second mitzvah, a second trait of Rabin, which is leadership for the service of all, for the service of the people, both our people and our neighbors as a whole package, and not for himself alone. During his first tenure as prime minister in the 70s, he resigned simply for having 2 foreign bank accounts in the US, a transgression so small it seems quaint in our era of so much corruption that someone would resign over such a small infraction. He was a leader of utmost integrity. In his 1994 Nobel Peace Prize speech, he said, "Of all the memories I have stored up in my 72 years, what I shall remember most to my last day are the silences." And he goes on in great detail. I encourage you after Shabbat to Google it and to read it in its entirety. I won't quote it in its entirety, but he goes on to describe how when, as a defense minister, a prime minister, an IDF chief of staff, a commander, he would give an order and everyone would leave the room to carry it out. And he would sit alone in silence, knowing people who did not yet know that this was true about their own future, would be going to their deaths. And the sense of responsibility for people's lives, the sense of responsibility for the weight of his decisions, the sense of the urgency to make decisions right, to serve all. This is how he lived. And at our community's gatherings and events on our challenging times, congregants have shared alarm over the wave of self-serving leadership of our era. Rabin reminds us it does not have to be this way. There is another way, and we can demand it, and we can reach it. Third, Rabin had the incredible midah, the incredible trait of understanding both and not being, not having the tunnel vision of seeing things in terms of either or. He famously said, "We must strive for peace as if there is no terror, and fight terror as if there is no peace." And his ability to hold both of these in his mind at the same time, to hold them both as worthy goals, is something that is far too rare in our era. And folks have shared at events we've had on our challenging times a concern that we're living in an era when increasingly the loudest voices are the most extreme ones, the most black and white ones. And the ability to hold two different ideas in his mind at the same time and lead by them both, because they are both true, because they both have to be attended to, safety and a better future for all alike, remains remarkable. And not just two goals in his head at the same time, but the ability to hold implicitly also short-term and long-term. We must fight terror, implicitly saying there's a limit to what can be accomplished today. But we must also work for peace. That is to say, we must never forget that we have to work today to make more better options possible tomorrow. And he was able to do both at once. This is what the Talmud describes as elu ve'elu, both these and those are the words of the living God. That is to say, there is truth in both of them. And his ability to do this is a tonic for our times. But perhaps most poignantly, Rabin was a student of the rabbinic vision of a dispute for the sake of heaven, a machloket l'shem shamayim. Now, as a labor kibbutznik secularist. I doubt he thought of it consciously this way. But he inherited, for 20th century Israeli leadership, the rabbinic ideal that different views can actually be shared in dialogue, and the dialogue can unite us rather than our differences dividing us. I encourage you, if you're curious to know more about the way he carried this vision out in practice, to read the great book, The Prime Ministers, by the former Israeli speechwriter and diplomat Yehuda Avner. It's a first-person, close-up memoir of the leadership of these Israeli prime ministers for whom he worked through his stories of working with them. And when you read the stories from the 70s of Rabin's first tenure as prime minister, and then opposition leader Menachem Begin, the leader of the Israeli right, who then came to power thereafter, it reads like a fusion of the West Wing and Fiddler on the Roof. Their banter, their wit, their humor, their ability to frankly share their political differences, but in dialogue and ultimately in respect and love, is simply remarkable. Even in the Entebbe hostage crisis, which happened during Rabin's first premiership, when it appeared at first that there was no military solution and that the only choice was to negotiate with the terrorists, Menachem Begin supported Rabin's decision to do so. And once the IDF did develop a military solution, the daring rescue plan that ultimately was carried out, then Begin supported that as well. It wasn't about point scoring. It wasn't about you versus me. It was teamwork to solve problems. It took a Rabin to do this, and it also took a Begin to do this. They both deserve credit. And so, in light of the fact that Rabin lived by these principles, it is all the more tragic that he was murdered by a fellow Jew. It is a trauma beyond words. It is a trauma that marks Jewish history as much as our ancient ones do. And indeed, when the current Israeli president, the figurehead role, like the Queen or King of England, when the current Israeli president, Yitzchak Herzog, was sworn into power in 2021, he said then, Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred, is what brought about the destruction of the Second Temple. And this is a classic rabbinic Talmudic tradition, that the infighting of different Jewish sects weakened us against the Romans, and that baseless hatred brought us down. And so Herzog quoted that in 2021, and he then said, this same baseless hatred, this same sectarianism and polarization that charge us such heavy prices, they do so even today, each day. So our time remains complex, and there is no one simple solution. But in the midst of the chaos of our time, perhaps Rabin's legacy can call us back amid the chaos to these first principles, to these principles of holding on tight in the face of all the sand thrown in our eyes by an unhinged world, to the belief that changing the status quo is possible and that we can break conventions to reach a better place. Holding on tight to the vision of a dispute for the sake of heaven, a machloket l'shem shamayim. Holding on tight to the vision of leadership to serve all and not just some. Holding on tight to seeing the both and not just the either or. These are things that perhaps can be a tonic for our troubled world. And it's my prayer that they may be. We will see in a couple weeks, as the parshiot of the stories of the ancient Yitzchak unfold, that as Yitzchak ultimately marries Rebecca, that this happens just after his mother Sarah has died. And we see in the parsha that Rivka's own father has died because she's described as living in her mother's household, and only her mother and her brother are there. And so we see in that moment that there is a certain, as the modern biblical commentator Robert Alter puts it, a curious symmetry between the ancient Yitzchak and Rivka. They're both grieving. And as the Torah tells us, and Isaac loved her, and he found consolation after his mother's death. In other words, when we're grieving, if we channel it toward offering love to each other and finding love from the other, perhaps we can use it to build a better future. And as the ancient Yitzchak shows us, and as the modern Yitzchak shows us, perhaps we may yet do the same in our time. So may it be God's will. Ken Yahrtzeit.